Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Secondly, I'd like to welcome you all here today. 7 schools are joining us within the cinema at QAGOMA, Cinema A, but we also have a number of schools that are joining us or streaming in via our YouTube channel for this first pilot event, which is a Q&A, APT8 Q&A for secondary school students. I'd like to thank the schools and teachers who are involved in this particular Q&A, because this is something we're testing out and we're wanting to see if it's a model that we'd like to take into the future. So far, the success and the response has been evident for us as a gallery, not only with the interest from schools and teachers, but also the interest of staff within the gallery, particularly staff from the learning team, which is a section that I have the pleasure to lead. So QAGOMA Learning is a new initiative for the gallery, and part of our deliverable is to work with schools and students and teachers. But the other section particularly interested in this program is the curatorial team at QAGOMA, and we're joined today by Curator of Contemporary Asian Art, Reuben Keehan, who has had a look at the questions that have come in from schools, and our section Learning, as well as with Reuben, have selected 8 questions, 7 from those schools in the room and 1 from a school from Gympie, James Nash State High School. So we have a nice figure of 8 questions, which fits well with APT8. So we're looking forward to unpacking these questions. The questions have been selected based on trends that have emerged across the many questions. So I think there was about 59 questions that came in all up. So hopefully with the 8 that we've selected, we'll be unpacking questions that will answer a good percentage of those 50 plus questions. So let's make a start. First question is coming from Ipswich Grammar School. As noted on the paper for those questioners, please start by introducing yourself and make sure you feel welcome.
G'day. My name's Lucas Schober. I'm year 12 from Ipswich Grammar School. And I just want to know, is there a selection criteria when choosing artists for APT8?
Thanks for that. Look, there's no formal selection criteria. There is more of a regional selection criteria. So what we try to do is look at artists who are working in Asia, the Pacific and Australia, but also their diasporas. And by that I mean artists who have been born to families who have moved away from the Asia-Pacific region. An example of that is the artist Hitain Patel, whose image you can see on the slide behind me, his terrific work, The Jump. Hitain was born to an Indian family living in England. He's been raised there. His work is not particularly about any kind of Indian experience, but more specifically, it's about his experience growing up in an Indian family in Britain, where he feels something of a tension between the expectations of his family to grow up with an Indian cultural background and the real heroes that he identified as a kid growing up. Really, people from Marvel Comics, in particular Spider-Man, as being key figures for him. So his work is specifically about that kind of experience. So yeah, those are really the range of artists we look at. That's actually quite a lot of artists when you think about it. Asia and the Pacific take up something like the 2/3 of the world's population. So there's a tremendous amount of work that's happening there. We can't really be representative of the entire region. So for example, China is a country of over 1.3 billion people. Within this exhibition, we're only able to actually show 3 Chinese artists. So while a selection may not be indicative of the all of the work that's going on there, we hope that it does say something to that context and create a kind of a bridge to our audiences. The The artist selection is also determined by our research focus. So it's really driven by the curatorial team here at the gallery. We have a specialist Asia Pacific curatorial team. I think there are about 4 of us at the moment working in that area. And we have a lot of ongoing research that is influenced not only by our own interests, but by the institutional history that we work within. So the history of the projects that have happened at the gallery, in particular, the 7 Asia Pacific triennials that have come before this one. So we see it really as a series of exhibitions rather than just a standalone exhibition. Also, a great legacy of those exhibitions has been the collection, and we continue to develop that collection, and that development is really aided by the APT. We do try to acquire a good number of the works that go into the exhibition, or by artists who have been associated with the exhibition in the past. So our collection policy determines some of that selection. A really good example of that is some of the larger scale projects in the shows. There's over in the Queensland Art Gallery, there's tremendous work, quite a large scale work by Korean artist Hagyu Yang. It's a large suspended Venetian blind piece. Now that is the kind of work that we will try to commission a long way in advance. So earlier in the process, we'll identify certain artists that we want to work with to create these larger scale projects, which obviously require a lot more time and planning in order to produce. Then we will continue our research, on the ground research, identifying artists that we may not be aware of through other media such as the internet or magazines. Really the best way to see what's going on is to actually go to a place and talk to artists and meet people who may not be within what we might call the circuit of contemporary art exhibitions. And that process in total takes about 18 months. So we start with the very big projects, and we're continuing to perfect our list. And what we do during that process is we come together at regular meetings and present short lists of artists, which we whittle down to the final list of artists. There are about 83 artists in this exhibition. The number of artists that we would have proposed for this probably would be about 300 that we then, whittle down to produce the exhibition. Really, that's a pretty standard way of exhibition making. Putting an exhibition together often involves a long list that you narrow down, and through that process you are still discovering things or thinking of things that may be interesting. So we'll kind of consider those later on. Then we give ourselves about 12 months to produce the exhibition itself. So that's the operations and logistics side of things. So briefly, what we look for is really what we find interesting, what we think will fit into the broader framework that we've established over 20 years of exhibition making with the APT, and works that either continue the conversations in an interesting way or which branch off in radically new ways. So it's always a process of discovery. It's always a process of us finding a balance between making the exhibition accessible and finding new and exciting things to put in there at the same time.
Fantastic. In terms of the selection process that we've just heard outlined, there is also the importance of the thematics that the curatorial team works towards, and that flows on nicely to our next question from Brisbane State High School.
I'm Sally Marquis-Kyle in Year 12 at Brisbane State High, and my question is, why has the body and performance emerged as such a powerful artistic media in APT8?
Thanks for that. I'll pop up an example of that. This is still from Anida Uali's Buddhist bug performance. Look, it's really a combination of factors. There was a desire at the outset of our research for this APT to incorporate a lot more performance into the exhibition than we maybe had over the previous few. The very, very early APTs in the 1990s were actually notable for having quite a lot of performance. So it's not the first time that we've shown a lot of performance in the show. It's also a reflection of the fact that performance is such a vital practice within the Asia Pacific region, and that's come about for a number of reasons. The complexity of the region has meant that there are different reasons why performance has emerged as a very prominent medium within the region, and those would include there being long-standing cultural practices, so dance and storytelling might be very, very important cultural activities within certain communities. Performance is a natural continuation of that. You can see that across the exhibition, and particularly in the terrific Yumi Danis project, where a number of dancers from across Melanesia came together to collaborate and produce this really extraordinary work. But at the same time, there are specific social conditions which can make performance a more natural mode of art making for artists. So an example of that might be that materials might be scarce or expensive. Performance, some artists have told us, is a way of producing art without having to outlay a great expense. It's very immediate. It can be very, very cheap. All you have to do is use your body. So that's popular in certain contexts. In others, making art and showing art is actually a little more difficult than it is here. And so there are the attentions of the police that can be attracted by certain art exhibitions. In certain contexts, Burma is a good example of this. The police like to vet every single art exhibition to make sure that it's that what's been shown is not challenging the status quo too much. So performance is actually a way of getting around some of these guidelines. If you don't have a physical object, there's nothing for the police to see. And so often performance will take place in quite clandestine contexts, in a very small space where the audience will largely consist of other artists. And for this reason, there's quite a lot of difference to, the global fashionability of performance within big art museums. And it's become quite common in the past few years for large museums, large biennial and triennial events to show a lot of performance art. But that's largely market-driven. It's driven by the fact that there are now ways to collect performance art and people who are willing to pay for it. Institutions are more willing to take risks on showing performance art. It's something that's quite unpredictable. If you see a painting, the painting is not going to change in the process of you taking it from the artist studio to putting it in the museum. Institutions have been quite tentative about allowing artists to do something which they can't actually predict. They're getting a lot more comfortable with that now, and that's the circumstance that's in allowing performance to be part of these big exhibitions. And at the same time, there's an interest in audiences in seeing performance art. So a lot of the popularity that contemporary art has achieved in recent years has broken down some preconceptions that used to exist among audiences about what art could be. So the traditional media and traditional styles still persist within these kind of exhibitions. You can see a lot of painting and sculpture in the APT, a lot of fantastic painting and sculpture in the exhibition. But at the same time, audiences are quite open to new experiences. They're more open now than they were 20 years ago to seeing things like performance and installation. We made a curatorial choice within this exhibition to connect performance to other forms of practice that are happening within the region. And so we were interested in the way that performance might relate to kinetic art, for example, so art that moves, sculpture that moves, to installation, and the way that you actually have to use your body as a viewer to fully understand and experience an installation. It's something that you actually have to move through, so you're an active component. In a way, you're performing as an audience member in order to complete the experience of the work of art. And also in figuration, which is actually one of the oldest forms of artistic expression. The fact that people are picturing things through paintings, photographs, videos, and other media. In all of these areas, we see there is a focus on the human body. And so we can take the discussion that starts in performance and we can connect it to other modes of practice in a way that is linked by certain motifs. And what a lot of these works have in common is that the human body is either depicted or invoked in some way. Yeah.
So I might just riff on that, Reuben. In terms of that breakdown of body into figuration, installation, and kinetic art, having come from a background of teaching secondary art, particularly to senior secondary students, it's comparable, I guess, students, to the breakdown of when you get a body of work, a key concept that you have to break down. So I'd encourage you all, if you haven't yet, or even if you have already, to go back through the gallery spaces and think about where certain works would sit for you in terms of that breakdown of body into installation, kinetic art, and also figuration. So the next two questions actually talk to that in some way, because they are in particular looking at two different artworks, both of which could be explored in terms of those terms. So we'll start with the first question, or the next question rather, is from Chloe from Yeronga State High School.
Hello, I'm Chloe and I'm in grade 11 at Yeronga State High. So when I look at Tumbash model XQ, I interpret the large, mangled mass of human bodies incorporated with the 4 harmonious animals of Buddhism to represent the strain the Earth's large human population is having on the environment. Is this what the artist intended? And where might the artist stand on our environmental impact as human beings? Thank you.
Thanks so much for that question. This is a really fascinating painting, and it's one I'm particularly fond of within the exhibition. It's by a young Mongolian artist called Urintuya. And this is the first time that we've been able to show Mongolia in the Asia Pacific Triennial. We've shown 4 artists. They all work in a similar style. It's known as contemporary Mongol Tsurig. Mongol Tsurig is just quite literally means Mongolian painting. And they use that style to deal with certain issues that confront them within their daily lives in Mongolia. But what's interesting about this is that while they're focused on very local issues, they can also be interpreted much more broadly. And I think I'll speak a bit later on about the kind of audiences that artists have in mind when they make work these days. But with this work, the style contemporary Mongol Tsurig is very interesting because it's a revival of a style that was developed in the early 20th century. So a style that's actually a kind of Mongolian modernism. And the style was developed at a time when Mongolia was trying to declare its independence from China, which it had been ruled over for several hundred years. And in trying to declare its independence, there was also a big push to develop a specific national identity. And you might see something similar when you think about Australian art around the time of Federation and the impact that Australian Impressionist painting had on developing certain national ideals and a national identity that was quite distinct from the European cultural identity that had previously been quite a dominant model within Australia. So as they were trying to develop this identity, they developed a painting style that combined a number of different existing styles. It combined the perspective and the compositional style of Chinese painting, which appears very flat to European eyes, doesn't actually have a vanishing point. They combined the imagery that was used in Khitan equestrian painting that had been developed in northern China. And they added in some of the techniques and imagery of Tibet Tanka painting. Tanka painting is the painting that's most associated with Tibetan Buddhism and in the Buddhism that of the Himalayan area in general, which is very, very influential in Mongolia and certainly was at that time. And that's characterized by its very, very fine brushwork, which you can see in this painting and in others, as well as the use of these Buddhist symbols. So the four harmonious animals, which you mentioned, are of course quite a common symbol within Thangka painting and Buddhist painting in general. The story of the four harmonious animals is about these four animals, the elephant, the monkey, the rabbit and the bird, that are having a conversation about the age of a tree. So these animals are often pictured next to a tree as they are here. They're all trying to draw on their own experience, and out of the conversation they find that the bird actually carried the seed which planted the tree from which it grew. So this harmony of the animal and of the tree was an example of the harmony that could exist within nature, and so the four animals lived in harmony thereafter, and this is why they're pictured in this way. Into this, Urintia has introduced this mass of writhing bodies. Now, this mass of bodies is something that she uses a lot in her paintings. There are 3 paintings that you'll see by this artist in the APT, and all of them include this mass of bodies. Now, this is a very interesting introduction by the artist because it asks the question of what is the role of humans in this schema? You know, how do they relate to animals and to plants, to nature as such? And the bodies aren't really a particularly peaceful insertion into this image. So while the animals all seem to be kind of subsisting quite well, the bodies are kind of writhing and tangled and looking very uncomfortable. And this speaks to certain conditions within Mongolia, which is a very, very large country, but one with quite a small population. And traditionally, the Mongolian people had been nomadic. They'd spent millennia, really, moving around quite freely. As modernisation picked up throughout the 20th century, and certainly after the globalisation of the Mongolian economy in the 1990s, there's been very rapid urbanisation. And Mongolia's capital of Ulaanbaatar is now home to 2 million people. Now, that's a lot for a country of just 3 million people. So you can imagine the 2/3 of the population of Australia living in one city. That'd be quite an extraordinary thing. So this tangle of bodies actually represents, something of the reality of contemporary life in Mongolia, certainly in the city in which the artist lives, where people who had previously moved around quite freely are all forced to live together within a very, very small space. At the same time, there's been, there is a feeling, I guess, among a lot of artists of Urintia's generation that in addition to this shift in lifestyle, there's been a fairly negative impact on the way that people think about the land. So previously, the relationship with the land was quite symbiotic. Land didn't belong to you, you belonged to it. Whereas now there's a lot more of an exploitative approach to land. And so the sense among a lot of these young artists is that the land is it's being used for things, it's being exploited. Mining is large-scale industry in Mongolia, and there's fears that that's disrupting the ecosystems. And that they feel that this mentality is something that's actually being produced by contemporary society, and that it's a rather negative aspect. So you're right, there is a very kind of a strong sense of what people's impact on the environment is. But I think there's also a bit of hope in this painting as well. I think there's hope that that despite the predicament that people have landed in, and despite the predicament that they've put nature in, that there is actually the chance of becoming harmonious once more. So being inserted into the story of the four harmonious animals, people can actually find a way to live in harmony with their environment after all.
Thank you very much for that question. I have the pleasure of asking the next question, which has been written by Hayden Capel. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly, Hayden, from James Nash State High School in Gympie. Again, this is a question about a particular artwork. So with regards to David Medala's foam machines, which we can see behind me here, where did he get the inspiration for something so ambitious and different? How did he go about turning that idea into a moving piece of artwork? Hayden has also noted that he loves the dynamic way the art almost creates itself in real time and can be seen over and over again without being the same. Thank you, Hayden.
This is a really terrific work, and it's one that was one of the works we identified quite early on as wanting to show. David Medala was an artist that we felt is a very senior artist from the Philippines, was somebody that we really needed in our collection, and somebody who spoke to this idea of performance and movement that we were very interested in exploring within the show. So it's not performance art, but it does perform, it does move, and it really kind of opens up that question of movement, and it relates in quite metaphorical ways to the human body as well, which I'll come to in a moment. Medala, as I mentioned, is quite a senior artist. He's been working since the 1960s, and he's actually quite a key figure in the emergence of the experimental avant-garde in London during that period, and in the development of kinetic art, so art that moves, basically, art that's not static. And what he was trying to do when he was developing this work was to come up with a form of sculpture that was anything but the way that we conventionally regard sculpture. And those conventions included that sculpture was solid, that sculpture was timeless, that it was monumental, basically, that it didn't move. And he's come up with something that's actually quite permeable. Bubbles are things that you can, reach through and touch. Not that I would recommend you doing that in the exhibition space, but we can sort of see by the bubbles that this thing is flexible. We can also see that it changes, and in fact, it's never exactly the same. No two little protuberances of bubbles are ever exactly alike. And it's also quite a modest work in its ephemerality, and in the fact that it's not a huge solid object. It doesn't have that kind of monumental quality that we associate with sculpture. But there's also a very autobiographical aspect to this one, and this is quite fascinating. So the artist is drawn on his own memories in order to produce this work. And actually, the earliest memory is what he says is his earliest memory. It's actually quite a gruesome one. The artist was born in 1942 in the Philippines, and at that time, the country was under the occupation of Japan and was very much a part of the Pacific War. And he remembers, as a very, very small boy, a young resistance fighter being shot and dying in his yard. And this young man, he remembers, he was very struck by the fact that he was foaming at the mouth as he was dying. And this, he's connected to a number of other memories that have come from his youth and from the period that took him overseas to visit the United States and live in London. So he remembers his mother's cooking with coconut milk foaming on the stove. He remembers his first encounter with a glass of beer in Edinburgh with its frothy head. He remembers the fluffy clouds above his home in Manila Bay, and he also remembers looking down on the clouds when he first flew overseas to the United States. So there are a lot of these very personal allusions that are brought into the work as well. Those aren't necessarily there to read on the surface. That's not necessarily information that you need to be able to enjoy this work. But it is interesting information to know when you think about how artists work, what inspires them. And so they can be inspired by very, very formal concerns. They might want to challenge the way that we think about a particular form of art. In this case, for David Medala, it was sculpture. But that challenge doesn't exclude your personal experience and his own personal experience, which is brought to the work. And so inspiration can come from a number of different places. It doesn't just have to come from one place. And this is the inspiration for this fantastic work.
Our next two questions take us back to thinking about APT8 from a curatorial perspective, but also further give us opportunity to explore the cultures and contexts with which the works and artists that made them are coming from. So we'll shift now in that topic, beginning with a student from Kelvin Grove State College.
My name is Leon Wong, and I'm currently in Year 11 at Kelvin Grove State College. My question today is, when curating an exhibition such as the APT, which hosts a diverse array of cultures and countries, do you often find recurring themes or ideas amongst the works?
That's a great question, and it's something that we were quite conscious of in putting this particular exhibition together. We frequently find overlapping concerns among artists coming from diverse backgrounds, and I mentioned just how diverse the region that we're dealing with is. One of the challenges, I guess, is creating an exhibition that places those works in dialogue without decontextualizing them too much. It's really important to be able to think about their works in the context that they were produced. There can often be very specific readings that are produced by that. Looking at those last two works with all the detail, thinking about all the detail that went into how they were produced, is something that we try to convey, and we do that through a number of means. But one of the key ones is in the way that we put the exhibition together. So thinking about what work we put next to another one. Now, works of art are quite complex things. So while two works might have something in common, could be their medium, could be the style that they're produced in, could be a motif that's within them, an image or a theme, they might also have significant differences. And that produces certain challenges for us as curators. How do we put something in an exhibition without reducing it to a single reading? How do we enable people to be able to find multiple readings within that artwork? And the way that we've tried to do that this time is to regard those differences as part of the conversation. And so this, rather than saying all works are reducible to X, we say, okay, we take X as a proposition, but this could be A, B, C. There could be various different ways of thinking about this. And those differences, I think, are really, really important in an exhibition like the APT. The way that we put this particular exhibition together was kind of interesting. We felt, looking at the last few exhibitions that we'd made, that there perhaps wasn't too much of a thematic relationship between the works. So without wanting to actually have an overarching theme, what we felt was important was to place the works in a dialogue with other works that were quite sympathetic to them, so that the things that the artist felt very, very strongly about wouldn't be diminished by the way that we'd installed the show. And so when you look at the way that the exhibition's constructed, we thought about the big, large spaces that GOMA and Queensland Art Gallery divided up to, so the big main galleries, and we grouped the works accordingly. So in the space that you walk into on the right-hand side of the central gallery in GOMA, you'll see a lot of work that depicts the human body, and usually the human body accompanied by other people. So a depiction of crowds, of masses of people, and different ways of interpreting that. So we thought about some of the social structures and economic and cultural structures that bring people together in these ways. Work is one, that's one place. Education, you'll sort of see Nielei's sick classroom work. There are crowds in protest, and there are people who've assembled to celebrate things. So there are a whole different a range of ways that we think about groups of people coming together within that section. There are a lot of works that deal with the issue of land, so variations on landscape are quite integral to this exhibition. You'll see artists dealing with a lot of themes that are in common within that area. It was interesting, there were a lot of artists dealing with questions around mining. and the extraction of minerals from land and what that does to economies, what that does to the land, and what it does to the populations that live in these places. So that was interesting. We have artists from India, from Papua New Guinea, and Mongolia, all kind of, to mention just a few, all looking at these areas. How people respond to natural disasters, how people think about climate change, how people think about who owns the land and who lives in it. These are things that artists are looking at the moment. We're also quite interested in questions around gender and sexuality, which is a very interesting way of people thinking about people's identities. The fact that when artists are making work about their culture, oftentimes they're making, a question of who they are also involves the question of, whether they're male or female, or whether they identify with another gender, what the experience of women is within a number of these regions. It's a very, very central part of contemporary art discourse at the moment, and how they think about the roles that are kind of cut out for them in society. So all of these things have sort of come together within the exhibition. You'll also see a focus section on art from outside the major centres of India. So Indian artists who live in rural areas producing work that may not be regarded as contemporary art and might be regarded as very traditional, but which is actually dealing with very, very contemporary issues. And alongside that, we've shown works by artists who are drawing on what we call vernacular cultures, so forms of expression that aren't traditionally regarded as high art, street culture, domestic space, areas that are really, really important to the experience of everyday life that artists are very, very interested in. And by grouping these things together, we give some force to the ideas that the artists are looking at, but we make sure to leave enough room so that each work can be considered in isolation and to contextualise it so that it doesn't feel like it's just, it could have come from anywhere. Often there's a very specific cultural experience that creates that work. So hope that starts to answer your question.
It does also flow on to the next question, which is looking at those kinds of binaries between sort of first world and developing countries. So if we can pass over to Cannon Hill.
Hi, I'm Alicia McLaren in Year 12 at Cannon Hill Anglican College. APT8 consists of work by artists from both first world and developing countries. Despite these diverse economic and cultural differences, are there similarities between the issues explored by artists, or is it the case that artists in more developed countries make work that is less political and perhaps more self-indulgent? Thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, it connects to some of what I was saying about the issues that we're starting to see that are a part of a broader conversation, rather than just very localised issues. So as I mentioned, these include use of land. The use of public and private space is a very central issue. So you'll see in the work of the Cambodian artist Kfae Samnang a real concern with the way that space is being utilised, and people are often forcibly evicted from places that they're living in order for certain industries to replace them. In the case of the work that he's shown in the APT, rubber plantations, or new developments in urban space, and how public space is used. What is the space of public discourse, which is why we see a lot of artists, like this previous one, Kiri Dalena, dealing with public speech, protest, but also the way that the memory of public speech might have been repressed, or the degree to which it might linger. It's not always clear in this work. And while these reflect local experiences, they're often very similar to concerns being expressed elsewhere, which is a result of globalisation, I think, to some degree. The greater connectivity of the world, particularly of a lot of markets. So industries will operate in more than one country, but people are also much more linked together and by technologies such as the internet. Artists have a lot more immediate experience of things that are going on elsewhere. An example of that is this work here by Papon Saklaor, who is a Thai artist whose images are actually produced by looking at Google Maps, Google Street View images of the evacuated area of Fukushima in Japan. These landscapes that appear very beautiful, but which, in reality are, they cannot be lived in, they cannot be farmed because of the levels of radiation there. And he sees in this the idea that there is something darker beneath the surface within these beautiful landscapes that corresponds to his experience of Thailand, where he lives, which has this media image of being the land of smiles, but which has been the scene of a lot of political turmoil over the last couple of years. So this is one way of him dealing with that situation, by actually taking a corresponding situation from elsewhere. It's true that for artists in developing countries, contemporary art provides a way to access greater audiences. And this is another consequence of globalization, the fact that artists can show their own work internationally gives the language of contemporary art something of an urgency. And art, obviously, being a kind of an interesting space politically, is one where you can actually combine this sense of urgency with a degree of quite sophisticated reflection. But we also see artists from much more advanced economies, such as Korea, Japan, and Australia, dealing with these important social issues. So while they may not have such a sense of urgency to them, some of the social issues they'll be dealing with are very important. I'd say maybe the Korean artist Siren Yoon Young Jung, who deals in particular with the experience of Korean women and the spaces that they create for themselves in order to really have a say over their own lives, as opposed to being told what to do by a fairly, and what is effectively still a quite masculine system within that country. We also see a lot of work by Australian artists, and particularly by Australian Aboriginal artists, that is touching on some very, very difficult issues. So the challenge, I guess, that sort of comes back to when you're making an exhibition like this is how you hang the work in a way that doesn't diminish its political aspect. So we could look at Papon Sokolao's works and say, well, those are beautiful landscapes. I don't really know what the words say, but we could say this is a really nicely painted work. That's not really what we want to do. Of course the work is really well painted, but we think that that's something that the audiences will be able to pick up for themselves. But we've positioned that work specifically next to the work of a Samoan New Zealand artist, Yuki Kihara, who deals with the, and it makes quite a complicated work actually about the way that Samoa has been represented in imagery, the way that Samoan identity, and particularly half-caste identity, Yuki is of Japanese and Samoan heritage, has been represented, and to do this in the context of a country that's suffering terribly from natural disasters brought about by climate change. To position these two works quite together, they're complementary, they're not about the same thing, but it does draw our attention to the quite urgent issues that the artists feel that they need to convey with their works.
The next two questions are taking us away from thinking so much about culture and context to more thinking about time. And the next question is a pretty loaded question. And on the topic of time, we are fairly tight for time at the moment. But, it's probably one that could be unpacked in a 45, 2-hour event in and of itself, this question. So thanks for writing in such a meaty one. So we'll Hand over to a student from Brisbane Grammar School.
Hi, my name is Andrew McFarlane and I am in Year 12 at Brisbane Grammar School. I was just wondering how you think the role of art has evolved through time.
The short answer is that art has evolved, but so has the world in which art takes place, really. But specifically how it's evolved is also a complicated one because it's evolved in different ways in different places. So the idea of art that that I was brought up with, that I was educated, in high school and at art school, was one that was very much framed by European experience. But in my professional life, in the time since I've left, then the way that we talk about art has changed a lot. So we now talk a lot about different kinds of experience that art might be generative of. So not so much the European experience, but one living in Australia, the experience of Aboriginal people and the work that's produced by Aboriginal people in Australia has been really important. The work of migrant communities in Australia has been really important in changing that perspective. And the fact that the world is much bigger than Europe, so that there are 5 other continents on which art has developed separately and cultural practice has developed separately and actually has a kind of a different meaning. Globalisation, as I mentioned before, has been a really important factor in this, and the development of communications technologies have seen the weighting of the art world change quite a lot. And it's also seen contemporary art, which used to be a fairly kind of a marginal area as far as art exhibition went at institutions, become probably the most prominent form of art that's shown at institutions. Certainly in terms of the exhibitions that we do here at Queensland Art Gallery and GOMA, the vast majority is in contemporary art. Now, when I was in high school, it was almost impossible to see contemporary art in a big institution. And in the short period of time, the 2 decades since I left uni, that's changed quite radically. So now the big galleries predominantly show contemporary art. And contemporary art, of course, is something that comes from a lot of different parts of the world and is a very, very complicated beast. It doesn't necessarily rely on some of the very the European ideas of what art is and what it should be and what it could do. What's interesting is the way that, what's particularly interesting about the Asia Pacific for me is the way that artists take this thing that's called contemporary art and the way that they create this hybrid identity that's based on their own experiences and based on their own cultural traditions, local styles or local issues that all come into this big conversation about contemporary art. So because of this, the APT for me is something that's constantly challenged me to rethink my definitions of what art is and what contemporary art is, what it should look like, what it should do. And so from my own, just anecdotally, from my own experience, art's actually changed a lot in my lifetime. And as I mentioned, I think we have a lot of a bigger, we're more open to what we describe as art. So previously, whereas what could be identified as art was very narrow, it's now very broad. So a lot of what we might include in the exhibition might not have been regarded as art some time ago. One of the big institutional shifts is that artists are very inspired by documentary practice, documentary photography and documentary filmmaking, to the degree that a lot of what we now include in a museum exhibition actually resembles documentary film. We also see performance such as dance, for example, which was, not so long ago seen as quite separate to art. It's now something that's actually quite central. Artists use space. Artists, particularly installation artists, but also sculptors, even some painters, think about the way that their work is positioned in space. Dance and theatre are practices that involve a great use of space. Architecture is something that's become a big part of contemporary art. If you look at Asim Waqif's extraordinary intervention into the architecture here in the central galleries, you'll see an artist who's actually been trained in architecture and is very interested in the kinds of experience that architecture can produce. So that diversity and that constant challenge to the kind of very basic definitions of what art is, I think are quite new and are a good indication of the way that art might have changed over time.
And our final question from Toowoomba State High School is also exploring the nature of contemporary art.
My name's Kate Rawlings from Toowoomba State High School, and I'm in Year 11 at the moment. Does contemporary practice have a greater impact on social and political change than, say, the work of artists last century?
That's a great question. Art, as I mentioned before, does provide a space for reflection on social and political change. It often provides ways of thinking about social issues that are perhaps more complex and nuanced than the kind of issues that we would encounter or the way that they're discussed within the mass media. I think the time of art, the time frame of art in general, is something that provides a real space of difference to the mass media, rather than encountering or dealing with what we call the 24-hour news cycle and encountering a story within a very short period of time where people are asked very, very quickly for what their opinions are, or discovering news articles on Twitter. Art actually forces us to slow down and think about things. And our experience of an artwork may linger with us, and it may not be something that we feel immediately as a kind of an impact, but it may inform the way that we think about things. And so I think that that one of the kind of crucial differences to the way that social and political issues are talked about outside of art and inside of art has to do with this question of time. That said, cases of art actually having direct social impact are very rare. But artists do continue to engage with social issues. I think this question of technology, again, is an important one. Technology has been really crucial for circulating information about art and social issues. And it's confronted not just artists, but everybody in new ways, and has forced some kind of rethinking about that. I've shown this slide here by Liu Ding, whose work 1989 is in the show. In this painting, you can see the year is shown in a browser window. And this work is really about, he's a Chinese artist. And in China in 1989, there was quite a major civil disturbance. There was a very, very large protest movement that was asking really serious questions about the direction that the government was taking the country. And the crackdown on that movement was quite brutal. And it was something that everybody all over the world knew about because of the media images that were transmitted of that. You're not allowed to talk about this in China. And but the fact that the internet is now accessible to anyone in China means that this information is actually available. And so it's confronted the government in China with a real problem. How do you moderate the access to that information if you don't want people talking about it? And that has created a kind of a new scenario, a new context, I think, for artists who want to deal with political issues, for anybody who wants to deal with political issues. And the other thing, I guess, is that in daily life, artists don't just work in the space of their works. So artists will often work together to organise spaces themselves, quite separately of museums, or sometimes they'll insert something into a museum. So the Savage Club here on level 1 is an instance where a number of artists have worked together to kind of produce a space that's really their own cultural space. And that'll be used for discussions, for performances. But they do that outside of the gallery as well. And so artists have, I think, as much political volition as anybody else in the community in terms of the capacity. You have the capacity to organise groups that can advance an argument, can have a say. Everything from your Parents and Citizens Committee to your local football club. These are where people come together and they kind of create spaces for themselves to talk about the issues that matter and shape their lives. And in corresponding ways, artists do this in creating their own spaces, their own galleries, and sometimes their own initiatives that are really embedded in the communities that they work in. So it's really these two ways in terms of the self-organisation of artists, but also in the use of technology that I think is the space where art is really having a political impact.
It's a really nice note to end it on, because in some ways this forum in itself is doing that. So we're combining technology, we're bringing in a community to talk about a number of issues, and this is a forum that we're hoping to continue to produce for students to come in and discuss, I guess, the more academic nature of the subject that you're studying with your visual art teachers and your visual art classmates. So to wrap up, again, thank you to you for attending. Thank you to those schools that are taking up the opportunity to stream this event. Can I encourage you to put your hands together and thank Reuben Keehan for joining us today and sharing his knowledge. We are really keen to get some feedback from students that are attending the gallery. We have developed a survey particularly for today's event, and we will email out links to that to your teachers. Any feedback, particularly detailed feedback, is very much welcomed, as we, like I said, are looking to offer this program and other programs to students in future. I think going by the questions that we gathered, your knowledge and your insight into what we as a gallery are putting out for the general public is actually really helpful for us to engage with the way that you're engaging with us. So it's a mutually beneficial exchange. So that brings us, I guess, to the close for today's event. I'd also like to thank Danielle for joining us and signing today's event, which will be edited into a video to sit within QAGOMA TV. And this will be a video resource that schools can access to assist them in hopefully the same way that this is assisting you with your studies and your writing as well as your art making in schools. Thank you.